Well, good evening. Everyone's week has been good so far. Tonight we'll continue with our lessons on Bible virtues. The lesson is entitled Honesty, but according to this paper, it's entitled Truthfulness and Honesty. And so if you wondered, well, I didn't hear anything of what Leland was reading that said honest in it. That may be why. He got the truth part. We'll get the honest part. I guess there's a difference. I don't know if there is or not, but we're talking this evening about honesty. I think most of us would agree that honesty, what's the saying? Honesty is the best policy. We've heard that before. We would prefer people be honest with us, right? I think that's a given. Sometimes, though, honesty can hurt, right? Honesty can be difficult to hear. Sometimes, let's be real honest with you. In saying that right there, I have had a haircut and I have less and less to cut every time. But one of my kids told me I got to cut Monday night. And on Tuesday at school, one of my kids told me that there was a little bit of a shine to me on Tuesday. I was like, well, you didn't have to say that, but she did. And she was being quite honest, though, because it's the truth. And we like a little bit of honesty, but sometimes honesty can sting just a little bit. But ultimately, I think we prefer honesty because we can grow from honesty. And we need to know the honest answer quite often. We can be lied to. We can lie to other people. But ultimately, that just leads to more complications, more difficulties, more problems along the way. So we're going to talk a little bit about this tonight, and then we're going to do an example. Our lesson tonight will be a story that most of us are probably familiar with, but it's a story of honesty within the scriptures. The first time we see honesty in the Bible, again, I've used these examples many times, but a good verse here, Psalm 15 and verse 2, he who walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. And I think all of us would agree that we would want to speak the truth in our heart, walking upright and working righteousness. Last time, 3 John chapter 1 and verse 4. Again, there's only one chapter in 3 John, so it's 3 John verse 4. But I have no greater joy than to hear that my children, what's it say there? Walk in truth. And we talked that exact verse, I think we talked about when we were studying 3 John a few weeks back. But he says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. 3 Old Testament scriptures that run across the screen right there. The first one, Proverbs 12 and verse 19. Melvina, do you care to read Proverbs 12 and 19? All right. And so the truthful lips shall be established forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. What does that verse mean right there? What is Solomon writing there? Okay. Okay. No, that's well said right there. Let's go to the second one then. Proverbs 14 and 25. Jill, do you care to read that one in the middle? All right. And true witness delivers souls, but a deceitful witness speaks lies. We don't use the word deceitful that much, but what is deceitfulness? What is deceit? Okay. We would call it lying, but I don't always think of deceit as exactly the way we think of a lie. I think what you're saying there is you sort of funnel them in a different way. Yeah, kind of a trick. Yeah, I think that's a good word that we would use. Yeah. Right. The third one up here, Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 21. Lucille, do you care to read that one? All right. So 3 Old Testament all come from the book of Proverbs. I find it interesting that cite Solomon as being the wisest man and Proverbs as a book full of wise statements. And all three examples here are talking about truth, right? Is there wisdom in truth that should be stated here? New Testament scriptures. I don't know what happened right there. John chapter 8 and verse 32. We've seen this before. Annette, you care to read that one up there? All right, nothing new there for us. John 1 and 17. Mary, do you care to read the one in the middle there? This is what Leland read, or part of what Leland read there just a moment ago, that the law came through Moses, but the grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. We talked a little bit about that on Sunday as well. But the difference, we've talked about this a lot, the difference in law and the difference in grace and truth. And that verse is there's a clear divide, right? It's almost like it's two different things. The law through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And that word but seems to say that there is no grace and truth within the law, right? But we've talked about that, how that the law was not designed for grace and truth. The law was a hard and fast, you must follow this. Well, we see this sometimes. You see this, we had this at school. I remember even as a student, our student handbook, in the back of the student handbook said that if you commit this violation, then this is what the punishment is. And it was like, if you're tardy, you get this. It was all the way up to if you had drug possession, you get this. It was all this stuff. That was 25, 30 years ago at school. But those things were listed. But the problem with something like that is that it doesn't afford any grace, right? It doesn't really afford any grace. We've had laws in the state of Kentucky that did that as well. And so there needs to sometimes be some wiggle room and some grace. But the old law had no place for that, right? It was you did this or you did not do this. And then the last one, John 14 and verse 6, Jesus said to him, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh to the Father except through me. So John mentions, it gets our verses for honesty and truth there as well. We have one of these with each one of these papers. We should believe in Jesus, not because it feels good or because we've been taught a tradition. The strongest believers are those who have come to believe that the death and resurrection of Jesus are true. Telling the truth is important because anything that is founded on a lie or includes a lie, as Boo was saying just a moment ago, would topple under pressure. And so that honesty there shouldn't be a tradition. I shouldn't be here because 8 generations have all been here and this is what I'm supposed to do, but rather we should base our belief and our faith on the honesty and truth of scriptures. So tonight we're going to talk about a story in the book of Acts that most of us are probably familiar with. Are these names familiar to you, Ananias and Sapphira? If they're not, they hopefully will be by the end of the evening here. We're going to talk about Ananias and Sapphira. And this is a really good example of people who lied and did not have to at all. Have you ever known somebody that just lies all the time? There was a song a few years ago, the girl said, I know you lie, your lips are moving. And it was like, there's people that we know that are like that. There are people that could say right now, it's chilly outside, and I'd be like, I better go out there and check because I don't know if I can trust that statement or not. Well, Ananias and Sapphira are two people that lie. It's a man and a woman, and they tell this fib, they tell this tale, but there's absolutely no reason for them to make this story up. And we'll see what their punishment was. And they have only themselves, to borrow a Chris Stapleton lyric, nobody blame but me. They have to blame themselves for what they had done wrong. A little bit of backstory, though. And like so often, the backstory sort of sets the stage for what happens. This is Acts chapter 4, verses 32 through 37. I thought this would show up a little better. It doesn't show up great. So you might want your own scripture there to be able to be able to read this. But Acts chapter 4, verses 32 through 37 sets the stage for all of Ananias and Sapphira's mistakes. Boo, do you care to read this here for us?
distributed to each as anyone had need. And Joseph, who was also named Barnabas by the apostles, which is translated son of encouragement, for Levi, of the country of Cyprus, having land, sold it, and brought the money, and laid it at the apostles' feet.
So we're about 2 chapters to the right of the establishment of the church in Acts chapter 2. And so the early church, as we can see here, sort of dwelled together. Part of that was this anticipation of the end of the world coming. There was this belief that Jesus' return was imminent. And so the people lived in a state of almost, well, I'm going to go out and work today, but there's a real good chance I won't be here by Friday. The world will have ended. Well, that's not the way it turns out for these people. But at the time, they sold, as we can read there, they sold their stuff and they shared it and they were helping out other people. And this was all well and good for them. And they mention a man here, Joseph, or we know him as Barnabas, who was a Levite of the country of Cyprus, and he had land, and he sold it, and he brought the money and laid it all at the apostles' feet. So Barnabas here sells his land, and he gives it all to the apostles, which is an incredibly nice gesture. That said, there was zero requirement for him to do that. But what I see here in Acts chapter 4 in these verses is Barnabas realizing that there were people that were in need. We can almost trace this. To me, I read this as Barnabas may have been somebody who was a little better off than some other people. I don't know who else could maybe afford to sell a plot of land and just give it all away. But we don't know necessarily that one way or the other. But what this story does is sets the stage for Acts chapter 5. And it sets the stage for people to look at that and say, oh, I could be like that as well. Because what do you think? This is not a scriptural question, but what do you think people said when Barnabas sold his land and put it all there at the feet of the apostles and said, help other people out? What do you think people in the community, the neighborhood, what do you think they said? That's something else. I wish I could do that. I wish I could do that. And we sometimes see people, even today, we'll see people that make very generous donations to universities or to hospitals or to churches or whatever it might would be. And we say, wow, I wish that I had the ability to do that. The only thing is, I don't have, do they want both of my dollars or just one of them? How do they want to look at that? But Barnabas sets the stage for our for what we're talking about here. And so he's specifically named in this story. So we're going to read Acts chapter 5, and we'll skip through this. There's a few verses here that we're going to look at. But Acts chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, and then I've got a handful of questions that we're going to discuss. So the verses I think come first, but I don't know if the whole story comes right then. But Acts chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. Linda, do you care to read what we see right here? Okay. She says, you've not lied to men, but God. Let's go a little bit further here. Ben, do you care to read the next part here?
So great fear came upon all those who heard these things. And the young men arose and wrapped him up, carried him out, and buried him. Now it was about 3 hours later when his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. And Peter answered her, tell me whether you sold the land for so much. She said, yes, for so much.
Okay. And the last little bit, Maria, do you care to read the last one here? All right. So this is Acts chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. So I got a handful of questions that we're going to look at and for us to think about here as we go. Feel free to answer, but also feel free to comment, question, whatever else might be on your end as well. So let's see. First of all, we have to remember, what had Barnabas just done in the previous chapter? He had sold his land and done what with the money? He'd given it all. So in verse 1, what do Ananias and Sapphira, this husband and wife, what do they then do? Well, hold on just a second. They sold first, all right? We'll come back to the giving part in a second. But they sold a possession, a property here as well, okay? And so they had sold something, which again, much like Barnabas, was this a requirement? It was not a requirement from Barnabas. It's not a requirement from Ananias and Sapphira. But they, in verse 1, sell their land. And then in verse 2, what do they agree to do with the money that they received from the sale? Now, Lucille, that's the one you just tried to answer a second ago. All right, Lucille. All right, we got it. All right. So, Lucille, first thing, what did they sell? They sold the possession. And then what did they agree to do with the money? They decided that they would keep part of it and give the rest to the apostles. Now, was there anything wrong with that? So let's just make a magic number up out of nowhere. They sold it for $10,000. Would there have been anything wrong for saying, we're going to keep 5 and we're going to give 5 to the church? There wouldn't have been a thing wrong with it. We might do that. If we were to sell a piece of property, we might sell it for however much, and we can't afford to give everything because we got to buy a new house or this, but we might say, I have recently sold property and I'm going to give 5,000 of that to the church. And that's a wonderful gesture. Not required. No requirement at all. So in verses 1 and verses 2, what they're doing seems like a reasonable thing to do, buying and selling. But their heart here is in completely the wrong place. Because in verse 3, what does Peter say had happened to Ananias' heart? He said, Satan has filled it. What have you done here in verse 3? He had lied, but lied to who? Lied to, well, the Bible says in verse 3, lied to the Holy Spirit right there. And so Peter realizes that what Ananias and Sapphira had planned to do was kind of a scheme, right? There's a little bit of a scheme that's going on here, that they are going to sell a property and they are going to give some of that money to the church, but they're going to say what about the money they're giving? This is all, giving it all here to church. In a sense, modeling themselves after who? After Barnabas. What's the difference in Barnabas in chapter 4 and Ananias and Sapphira in chapter 5? He actually did what he said. They seem to be going the other way. Right. So if we look then at verse 4, concerning the possession owned by Ananias, what did Peter say to him in verse 4 regarding the money received from the sale? What does Peter tell him here? It was always your property. It was always your property. What else? What could he have done? Could he have given all of his money? Could he have given some of his money? Could he have given none of his money? Could he have put every single dollar that he made from that in his hip pocket and said, boy, I made a windfall on what we just sold? Could have done all of that. What does the Bible teach about giving? What does the scriptures teach about giving? We talk about this on Sunday mornings a lot. How are we to give? Freely, with a cheerful heart, right? We're to assess what we have and give back that which is to the Lord. It's not a 10% tithing like it was in the Old Testament. For what reason? It's not really a gift. We talked about that a few weeks ago. You start doing the fractions, right? You get into the cents. Well, it's $104.22. Do I round up? Do we round down? You get kind of technical about that. That's what your boss does, right? because you have agreed to work X amount of hours at X rate. And then at the end of the week, they give you whatever that math is. And then taxes are removed. And when you see your paycheck, it's not always a smooth $1,000 or $500 or $100, is it? It's this weird fraction of a number because it's a math formula that's worked it out. Well, we can't have that as what we have. In the New Testament, we were told to give freely, right? To give cheerfully, to give of our means. We see examples of people in the scriptures who gave a lot. We see examples of people who gave a little. We talked about that on Sunday, right? There's examples of people who gave a lot. It's not a tall amount of money lot, but they gave all that they had. Ananias and Sapphira here are being deceptive. They have lied. They have meant to steer someone in the wrong direction. They are attempting to trick the apostles here. They're attempting, we could say, to trick God. I think they wanted themselves to look a whole lot like, I think they wanted to hear the praise of men that Barnabas had got. Without a doubt. I'm sure that we think about it in the church today. They didn't have buildings like this, but I'm sure that people said, "You hear about Barnabas? Man, that was really nice." And they kind of wanted people saying those same kind of things. Do we fall into that trap sometimes as well? We absolutely do. So, verse 5, by the way, we are 5 verses into the story. And what happens to Ananias? Falls dead. Was any of this necessary? Not at all. So in verse 5, he falls dead. This is in a sense his punishment right here. Verse 6, what did the young men do? They come in, they took him, they carried him out, and they buried him right then and there. There's very little, we might say they didn't let any grass grow under their feet right here. It all happened really quick. Now, this is part of the story, but why do you think this maybe is included, that he fell dead, he took him out and buried him right then and there? Judgment was swift. It can end really quick for us, right? It can end really quick. And I'd hate to think that it could end when we're wrapped up in something like this. And again, none of this had to happen. All right. So we've got Ananias comes in, tells a tale, dies, and is gone. Verse 7. Here comes the second person. This is Sapphira. She's Ananias' what? Wife. She owned the property. They jointly owned the property. I don't know what possession laws were like at the time, but they owned this property. So when did Sapphira then come to Peter? She comes a little bit later, 3 hours later. And did she have any knowledge of what happened to Ananias? We read of no knowledge of what happened to Ananias there in verse 7. Now, what happened to Ananias did not have to happen. What happens to Sapphira? Does it have to happen? No, it does not have to happen either. Peter asked her, Peter asked Sapphira if she and her husband had sold the land for a certain price. Sapphira answers what? Yes, for so much. I don't know what the price is right there, but we just made up our number a minute ago. But in a sense, he's saying, did you sell the land for $1,000? And she's saying, we sold it for $1,000, right? Now, what's the problem with that? That was a lie as well. Was any of this necessary? None of it was necessary. I used the word scheme earlier because I knew I had the word scheme coming a little bit later. This scheme was not necessary at any point. Why was it not necessary? So, first of all, if we use the word tricking as deceit, we're not going to be able to deceive God in what's taking place. Why else was this completely unnecessary? It was all a free will offering. So not only have they sold property that they may not have even needed to sell, who knows, but they sold this property. They've ran this scheme to try and convince the apostles and God that this is what it's sold for. And all of this was done so that I could hear her say, that was impressive. I wanted to hear her say that. I kind of wanted to hear him say it and her say it as well. And so all of this was done, and none of it. It's like, I know I've asked that question a lot, but we've repeatedly, was any of this necessary? This wasn't even a good lie. Bear with me on that, right? But there's times when we say, man, I hate to tell them that. It's going to crush them. But this is indefensible because it was completely unnecessary. Who had Ananias and Sapphira tried, by the way, I know what that says there. Can you say it's Sapphira and Ananias? It just doesn't sound right at all. It's got to be Ananias and Sapphira. It's like you can't say it backwards. Who had they tried and tested in verse 9? They had tried and tested God. Is that a winning combination? It never works. Any effort to try and test God fails. We talked about this. We had this sermon a few weeks ago with Jesus and the lawyer and the guy and the lawgiver. The Pharisee asked Jesus. He said, "Who is my neighbor?" Right? And I think Ben, you actually mentioned this. You say he was testing Jesus, but Jesus does what to him? He spins the test around and turns it to him. Is there ever a situation where somebody, let's use the word from a card game, has anybody ever trumped Jesus in any of the scriptures? What about God in the Old Testament? Did they ever get one over on God, as it were? No. But Ananias and Sapphira tried and tested, and they failed. Now, what happened to Ananias a minute ago? Died. All right, so let's go to verse 10. What happened to Sapphira? Dead. And then what? Took her out and buried her. Two of them gone just like that over a pretty simple lie. Now, did any of them have to do this? So think about the morning that they started, or maybe the day before, right? Think about what their day was like. And they said, you know what? Barnabas sold this property and he received a lot of congratulations. We'll sell the property. We'll scheme to keep part of it in our pocket, and we'll give the rest of it. And we'll tell when we give the rest of it that this is what it is. And whenever everybody hears about this, they'll say, "Did you hear about Barnabas?" Whoa. No, Barnabas is old news. Did you hear about Ananias and Sapphira? By lunchtime, what's happened to both of them? Was it worth it at all? In the absolute best case scenario, what do Ananias and Sapphira get out of this? If they pull this off, if nobody finds out, what's the absolute best case scenario that somebody gets out of this? Praise them in. For how long? Till somebody, because somewhere down the line, somebody's going to do something a little bit better, and they're going, Ananias and Sapphira, that's old news. Let's talk about somebody new instead. If we're not careful, when we try to boost ourselves up or elevate ourselves or say, "Did you see what I did?" we get a little wrapped up in that, and what can happen to us? There is. There's typically a big, we can overinflate ourselves a little. What happens to a balloon when you overinflate it? It'll burst. All right. What happens when it overinflates? It will burst. I have told some stories of times about when I was in school and I played baseball. My senior year as a baseball player, my batting average was like 250. All right. That's not very good. That means 25% of the time I got a hit. But I don't remember any of the outs. I remember all the hits. And I tell you what, it sure seemed like I got a hit like 3, 4, 5 times a game. Math doesn't add that up, right? But why am I not going to tell you about all the strikeouts? You don't want to hear about that. That's a terrible story. It's not fun. I can tell you all about the stories of the hit that I got, but not the other ones that I was out. Those kind of things. But we kind of, if we're not careful, we build ourselves up. Do you know somebody who got a hit every time they went to bat? You ever known anybody in your life that scored a touchdown every single time they touched the ball? You ever known somebody who every time they shot a three-pointer, it went in, never without a doubt? If you know anybody that falls into any categories, you know somebody that's lying to you. All right? That's not what actually happened, but we kind of puff ourselves up there, right? Is it necessary? Does it really matter that I got a hit 20% or 25 years ago? It doesn't matter at all. And all I think of right now is every now and then Will and I go out and I swing the bat once. Like, man, I'm sore and hurting. You know, I couldn't get a hit if you hit me in the head with it and let it roll forward. No chance of it. But we sort of boost ourselves up sometimes, right? Yes, sir.
Sometimes we don't know, realize the seriousness of what lying is. Because over in Revelation 21, it talks about all liars will have their part in the lake of fire.
Does it matter at all, serious wise, if I had one hit or two hit? That doesn't really matter. But you're exactly right. If we're not careful, those little stories like that don't matter at all become bigger things. And all of a sudden, we're telling lies about everything. And what we see happen with Ananias and Sapphira. Never got a second chance. And we may not get a second chance either. So our lesson here should be what? Be honest about going forward. The might seem to promote us or pump us up a little bit, but there's no long-term glory in any of that. In fact, there's punishment in that, because Leland said there from in the book of Revelation. Now, it's interesting here, verse 5, and especially verse 11, we see, what does the Bible say about those that were in the church who heard the story of Ananias and Sapphira? So why do you think they were filled with great fear? Absolutely. So there's no sort of hiding, like we said. And imagine that. How many people, I have no idea what people thought about Ananias and Sapphira in the church. We don't have that in the scripture. But I would imagine that people may have liked them. Who knows? I have no idea. But I do know that Ananias and Sapphira would most likely have been known by the people. And the next day, what happens? They're not there anymore. And this story is going to know. People are going to know what happened, all because they had told this lie. All right. Questions. Final comments. It wasn't as long tonight. I apologize, or maybe that's good, Melvina. You're probably happy that we didn't. I'm not making you stay long here. So, any thoughts or questions about it? I hope we've been able to point out that this is an old story, but this is as relevant as any story that we come across in the Bible, right? Any teaching in the Bible, this is about as relevant as any, because we all can relate to this, right? We've probably all known people who have done this or the equivalent of this, not necessarily even to the church, but at work or in the neighborhood or whatever it might would be. People who were telling a fib and they didn't need to do it in the first place. Could you tell an example of this that's happened in your life? Probably so. Do what? Absolutely. We can maybe tell the example of ourselves as well. And so, when we think about, deceiving men, well, that can be easy. But what about deceiving God? Can't happen. It's impossible. And the thing is, who's the ultimate judge, man or God? God. And we may have something over on man, but they're not who's going to make the final judgment. It doesn't really matter. Ananias and Sapphira were trying to get the opinion of men, but that's not who made the final decision for them.
It wasn't necessary, they didn't have to lie, but it kind of was necessary to happen too, because that way we would have that example.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Offered the strange fire.
Mm-hmm.
God struck it down there and wanted to touch the ark of the covenant when it started to fall. And here God doesn't strike everyone, he's not going to strike everyone down the line.
Right.
But this is there so that we can know this is how serious God takes it.
Absolutely.
How serious God says this matter.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. Any other thoughts or questions or anything? Well, our Bible virtue for the evening, truthfulness and honesty. So I appreciate everyone's attention and participation, and we'll be back next week. And I meant last night I was going to start looking for next week, and I just haven't done it yet. So.
I think another way you can kind of put this in perspective too is whenever you're asked to do something for the church and you come up with all these excuses.
Right.
I mean, truthfully and honestly, is that really an excuse or is it really the reason you can't do whatever is needed for the church?
Right.